Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to this SPELive Gaia talk on CCUS, Carbon Capture, Utilization and Storage. My name is Femke Perlot-Hoogeveen and it's my pleasure to welcome you here to this Gaia talk and be your host today. I work with Deloitte in the Netherlands, where I focus on decarbonization, and I'm also the section chair of SPE Netherlands and co-chair of an upcoming SPE International workshop on CCUS scheduled to take place in the Netherlands in February next year. So a Gaia talk. You may have wondered, what is a Gaia talk? Now, Gaia talks are virtual dialogues around key sustainability topics. And you may recently have seen the announcement or even participated in the Gaia talk on reducing methane emissions. And Gaia is an SPE initiative that was founded about a year ago as part of SPE's sustainability journey. It is led by the current SPE Technical Director for HSE and Sustainability, Joanna Dunlop. Expectations of the oil and gas industry's role in society are changing. And Gaia, under the umbrella of Gaia, SPE is collaborating with a number of other societies, such as our sister societies, the AAPG, but also other organizations like IPICA, IOGP, OGCI, to ensure that the oil and gas industry ends up at the right side of history. Now, in the next hour, we will talk about CCUS, and we have a great panel for you. But before I start introducing the panel, I'd like to start with a question to you. Throughout the hour, you will have the opportunity, and I see the comments already coming in, to voice your opinions, to share your thoughts, to engage in the conversation. And the question that I'd like to ask you, and welcome your comments on it, is, should we rely on CCUS and other methods of mitigation for mitigating the climate effects of oil and gas consumption, or should we reduce oil and gas consumption overall? So you can put your feedback and your opinions in the chats. So whatever medium you're using for this SPE Live. So let's turn to the panel. We have a great panel of 4 experts with extensive experience in CCS. So our first panelist is Nigel Jenvey, Head of Carbon Management at Gaffney, Klein & Associates. Welcome, Nigel. Second, Mark Coalmer, CCUS Projects Director at OGCI Climate Investments. Big welcome to Mark Coalmer. And then Mark Zoback, Professor at Stanford University and Director at the Stanford Natural Gas Initiative, and also the current chair of the SPE Technical Session on CCUS. Welcome to you, Mark. And finally, Gabrielle Walker, Director and founder of Valence Solution, a consultancy focusing on sustainability and climate change solutions. So big welcome to all of you. And I'd like to have a quick look if we already have some comments in the chat on that first question. Let's see a lot of people from different places joining us. Various parts of the world. I see West Africa, Latin America, Europe. Let's see. Okay, I'll return to that later. There's a lot of comments about where everybody is dialing in from. Really great. Thank you all again for joining us. Let me start with some first questions, and also for you to get to know the panelists a bit better. Nigel, I'd like to start with you, please. You're a petroleum engineer and a very active member of SPE, and you've been involved in one way or another in carbon management for over 15 years. Can you tell us what attracted you in the subject of CCUS, and why do you think that we or anybody in this meeting should care about CCUS?
That's a great question. So I think what attracted me to be a petroleum engineer is what attracted me to carbon capture, use and storage. So I've always been attracted to solving complex problems ones that need the integration of various technical and commercial aspects, I think, to execute successful projects. And supplying more energy with less emissions, enabling continued prosperity to the world, I think, and also to lift people out of poverty is one of, but perhaps if not the biggest challenge humankind faces. I think it's actually a bigger challenge than what we're really facing today around COVID-19, or even historically success of getting to the moon. Why should I think people care? People should care because CCUS is one of the solutions to tackle climate change, but it's a vital one to address the lock-in of emissions from existing energy and industrial infrastructure and investments that have been made, and key to deliver net zero targets, given it enables removal of atmospheric CO2. So as far as the oil and gas industry and SPE members go, CCUS needs the oil and gas industry. I think that's pretty clear. But the oil and gas industry also needs CCUS. Many oil and gas companies are now committing to greenhouse gas emissions reductions, as I'm sure everybody's seeing. And the net zero targets, not just from their operations, therefore, but also from the end use of their products. CCUS secures continued use of oil and unlocks growth of natural gas. But CCUS also needs the oil and gas industry, its skills, its capability, the equipment, the technology, and our financial resources. Scaling up CCUS, I think, really improving performance and reducing cost of it relies on large-scale engineering and project management capabilities, coupled with technology innovation. And they're the qualities, really, I think, that underpins petroleum engineering. They're key attributes, I think, of the SPE members. We're also well placed with about 3/4 of CO2 capture today in large-scale facilities is from oil and gas operations. And the industry accounts now, I think, for more than 1/3 of overall spending on CCUS projects. So I think we are committed to it. We have the skills and we can deliver this.
Okay, thank you very much, Nigel. That's very clear what attracted you, and also immediately already giving some context on the role of the oil and gas industry in this space and the relevance. Gabrielle, I'd like to go over to you, please. You're a chemical engineer by training, and you've done a lot of things, and I will not have enough time to share with our audience all your experience. So I'll focus on what you do today. You founded Valence Solutions, and you work with a broad range of stakeholders on climate solutions. What is your view, being sort of in the linking pin of technology and society, on why should we care about CCUS?
Okay, thanks for that. And I noticed actually when I saw the question that you'd put up, my answer was, I think it should be both. And I've seen that we've had 3 different both ands coming in from the audience as well. So I'm with you on that one, definitely. I think we need all of the above on the table. And I think one of the things that CCUS has suffered from has been, it's been kept in its own box as a sort of technology in a box separate from everything else. And I think that's one of the biggest ways that we need to stop thinking about it, and we need to start thinking about it much more as a transition enabler. And I'll say why I think that in a moment. But you're right, Femke, I've done a lot of things. I've done science and politics and media. But for the last 10 years, I've been working in the private sector, a lot with energy companies, oil and gas companies, and in the energy transition. And really trying to understand not how oil and gas companies see themselves on the inside, how people see them on the outside, and how we can build some bridges to make some really vital technologies happen. And I founded Valence Solutions with a very brilliant team, specifically to look at some of the harder topics, the ones that maybe other climate advocates weren't so eager to look at. And I think with CCUS, the reason I got interested a few years ago was that I looked at the numbers. I talked to my friends who are scientists in the IPCC and said, can we get to 2 degrees without CCUS? And they said, no. I said, what about 1.5 degrees? And they said, you're having a laugh. And yet then I thought, well, why isn't the climate movement? Why isn't everybody who cares about climate? Why aren't the politicians? Why aren't they all the people looking at the energy transition all fighting for CCUS? And the answer was they weren't, but why? So the last couple of years, I've been doing a project which is partly sponsored by the OGCI, actually, and also by BHP and several others. And many people have given very generously their time to talk to me about what they think about CCUS, from Greenpeace through to Chevron and Exxon and everyone in between, and lots of heavy industry players as well. And what we've learned is really important, which is that a lot of people have noticed what we've noticed, that you can't get to climate without CCUS. It applies in lots of different areas. But the other thing is, a lot of people are very, very mistrustful, because CCUS feels like something that's a delaying tactic. It's something that, you know, will divert resources from real solutions. It's an old-fashioned technology when we ought to be rethinking everything. It's sort of got a lot that's against it and not so much going for it. In fact, one brilliant guy said to me, the only thing that CCUS has got going for it is that it can save the world. So that's why I started working on CCS and tried to understand what was wrong. And I think that lack of trust, there's a lot that the oil and gas companies can do about that. I think Nigel's entirely right. The oil and gas companies need CCUS at least as much as CCUS needs them. And I think that one of the things that we've been told is show us real projects happening on the ground, not just pilots, but all of these new industrial clusters are really promising for that. Really show us it happening on the ground. Show us where it's really applicable. And in my opinion, it certainly needs to be applied in the heavy industry process emissions. I think it could also be a very big enabler of hydrogen, of blue hydrogen, to get to green hydrogen. I think there's many parts of the world outside Europe and North America where a lot of the thinking is, where it could also be important to apply it to power. But the real reason that I think CCUS is going to be vitally important is that we have to have negative emissions technologies. And once you've taken the CO2 out of the atmosphere, you have to have somewhere to put it. You can put it in biology, or you can put it in geology, and we're going to need both. And that is what has been driving me again and again and again to try and figure out what we can do to make CCUS happen at scale.
Thank you, Gabrielle. And yeah, excellent point, I think, on going from pilots to real projects. Mark Zoback, you are the chair at the technical section on CCUS, and one of the things that I've heard you mention a couple of times is the importance of scaling up. Can you give a bit of background on your involvement with the section and your view on the experience there is in the industry on CCS and the experience for scaling up CCUS?
Sure. I think both Nigel and Gabrielle have made a number of very fundamental points. You know, by injecting the CO2 into the subsurface, we remove it from the atmosphere. We're not just lowering the rate at which we're producing greenhouse gases, as we are with a lot of the other things we do as part of decarbonization strategies. When you look at where we have to go from a climate point of view, whether you look at OGCI or you look at IEA or you look at the Shell Sky scenario, for example, they're talking about a volume and a timescale that are truly mind-boggling. And what I mean by that is for large-scale storage of carbon in the subsurface to really play a meaningful role in reaching a 2-degree scenario, we have to be injecting something on the order of 4 billion tons of CO2 per year into the subsurface. Now that's a big number that doesn't necessarily mean anything, but let me put it this way. CO2 in the subsurface is in supercritical form. It's not a gas, it's not a liquid, but it's a lot more like a liquid than it is a gas. 4 billion tons is basically equivalent to the 30 billion barrels or the size of the global oil industry. So we're talking in 20 years from now, injecting a volume of fluid that's comparable to the total amount of oil that's produced, distributed, processed, and consumed in a year. So, we have a sense of what that is: 1 million wells, hundreds of thousands of kilometers of pipelines, hundreds, if not thousands, of processing facilities, distribution facilities, and so on. And that's where we need to go if storing carbon in the subsurface is going to play its required role. And to come back to what both Nigel and Gabrielle mentioned, the oil and gas industry is the only industry that can do this. So the world needs the oil and gas industry to not only continue producing oil and gas — we're going to need oil and gas for decades into the future — but also to help solve this tremendous carbon problem. And storage of massive amounts of CO2 in the subsurface in a short period of time is going to be absolutely critical.
Okay, thank you, Mark Zoback. I'd like to go to Mark Coalmer of OGCI Climate Investments. Mark, you are the CCUS Projects Director for OGCI Climate Investments. Not everybody may know what OGCI does or OGCI Climate Investments. Can you give a bit of background and also about your role as part of OGCI Climate Investments?
Sure can. And, starting with OGCI first, Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, it's a consortium of a dozen of the world's largest oil and gas companies. And somewhat like Mark Zoback said, there's a unique place, and Nigel hit this as well, a unique place that oil and gas has in helping to solve this climate problem. And those companies realize that, formed a consortium so that they can collaborate together and do more than they could do individually. Each of those companies, of course, doing a lot individually as well, too. Well, one of the things they did as well in the OGCI is form Climate Investments. And Climate Investments is actually a $1 billion+ fund that's the investment arm of the OGCI. So we go about solving this climate challenge in really three areas. First is reducing methane emissions. The second is in reducing CO2 emissions. And third and finally, the one we're talking about here today is CCUS. And as the other panelists said, all the reasonable conversations about climate mitigation just require CCUS to happen.
Okay, thank you. I'm looking at a couple of comments that we have received on the chat. One is that there is a difference in how the generations are looking at the role of the oil and gas industry and the disproportionate level. Sorry, I'm looking at the exact wording. Global pollution is disproportionate in its generation. Taking the industrial emission standards to a normal and higher level globally is easier and faster to do. CCS is targeted to already cleaner industry and countries. Who can I ask to comment on this one? I'm looking in particular at the first part of this question from Belle Weaver.
I can take that if you'd like, Femke. Certainly it is disproportionate in its generation, and the more developed countries tend to have both the financial means and also the history perhaps to tackle the problem. So while we think it needs to be tackled everywhere, there's an opportunity in the more developed areas to take that knowledge and experience and apply it where there's funding available, and then to leverage that in areas that are developing and developing quickly so that the first developments they have there aren't replacing perhaps outdated technologies, but are advancing the latest technologies.
Yeah. Gabrielle, yeah, an additional comment?
I'm being very polite. I feel like I'm at school putting my hand up. If we're not on a panel, we can't elbow each other. I guess this is the best way to do it. I just wanted to say that I think when I mentioned CCUS as being an enabler rather than an individual technology in a box, that also applies to where you might want to apply it in the world. And I think I commented that there certainly in Europe and in parts of North America, we heard quite a lot of dislike of the idea of putting CCUS on power, saying we have renewables, we don't need it on power, but thinking more along the lines of industrial emissions. But there are other parts of the world where it might be appropriate for power. And I think there are places where there are alternative solutions, there are places where there's good storage, and you do need to think regionally. But while I have the talking conch, I just wanted to say that I'm going to be a bit challenging here, especially given my fellow panelists and given the audience too, which is that I've heard quite a lot of people saying only oil and gas companies can do CCUS, and so the world needs us to do it. And also saying that oil is going to be required for years. I don't know if both of those are actually true, and it might be that neither of those things are true. So this is a very controversial thing to say right now. I don't think we can assume that oil is going to be required for a long time, especially given the shock in demand that we've just had. But perhaps more importantly, I started off saying we need oil and gas companies to do CCUS, but I'm starting to see oil and gas service companies and engineering companies going, we can do this, we can do that, we can do that part. And I do think there's a ship that is potentially sailing for oil and gas companies. There's a danger of missing an urgent boat. Because, for example, I do think that CCUS could be a massive enabler for getting the hydrogen economy off the ground. But if it doesn't happen fast, then green hydrogen is really starting to be the thing that's being talked about in the European hydrogen strategy, in the German hydrogen strategy. So this is something that I think is essential, not to think, oh yeah, everyone's going to need us, we can do what we like, but actually get with the program.
Mark Zoback?
Well, I'd like to respond, I think, to what Gabriel was saying in a couple of ways. One is with respect to a hydrogen economy, CCS is absolutely critical, because you can't build a hydrogen economy without hydrogen, and we're going to get to hydrogen, if we get to hydrogen, via blue hydrogen, which means making it from methane, and therefore we still need to solve the carbon problem. So CCS and a hydrogen, evolution of a hydrogen economy go hand in hand. So there's no question about that. With respect to power and CCS, it's absolutely clear that with the increased availability, reduction of cost, the widespread availability of wind and solar, especially, we can skip over some things in some places. But the single best thing we could do for climate is to replace coal burning power plants with natural gas in the developing world. It's powerful in the sense that it provides a lot of power 24/7 and allows for economic growth. It has all the advantages of coal and none of the disadvantages. But that's not the end point. That's an intermediate point. As we continue to decarbonize, convert from natural gas to renewables, you still need a backup system, and natural gas and hydrogen are the backup systems. So, when we talk about CCS, none of us think it is the solution. It is part of a portfolio of solutions, and those solutions play themselves out in different places, in different parts of the world, because their needs and their current status is different. But it's going to be a big player, and whether it's the oil companies themselves or the oil and gas service companies, I think that's not a distinction we have to concern ourselves with. That will evolve as market forces demand. But for the SPE community, they have a role, and that, I think, we're talking to the SPE community, I think, and I think I'd like to emphasize the importance of what they do to helping to solve this problem. If we go to hydrogen, that's great. If we go to renewables where we can, that's great. But we still need the ability to store carbon in the subsurface at a very large volume in a very short period of time, and the SPE has to play a role in that.
Okay, Nigel, you wanted to comment on this one as well? Did you mute yourself, Nigel? We can't hear you.
I did. Oops. So just to emphasize a couple of points, I think that the others have said. Definitely, the developing world, we can really leverage and transfer the knowledge that's been gained in CCUS deployment elsewhere. There's learning curve based cost reductions and new technology that's required in order to improve the cost and performance of CCUS over time. And of course, by doing that in the developed nations and going through that learning curve, we can then transfer the lowest cost options over to the developing nations. I think that's one point, emphasizing what Mark said earlier on. I think also to catch what Gabrielle said was around the speed of deployment. We have a window of opportunity now, really before the sun starts to set on oil and gas, in terms of society's perception of its role in the energy space. And we therefore need to really increase the understanding and the transfer and the engagement that we all have. The whole industry, Mark is completely right about that, in getting CCUS deployment for it really to be a credible climate change mitigation technology. And it's off track. It's not on track to be that today, and we need to accelerate therefore the deployment for it to be credible in the eyes of others.
Mark, I see you raise your hand. I actually also wanted to go to you. So I saw a question on investments and cost.
Okay.
So can you say a bit about, what is the typical level of investment needed for an average project, if you can call it that, and what role does OGCI climate investment play in that?
Oh, that's a great question. And an average CCUS project, I wish we had a large enough data set to create such an average that made sense mathematically, that maybe Professor Zoback could agree with mathematically, right? But they're increasing, and certainly the numbers. But for the most viable projects tend to be the ones that have a relatively concentrated CO2 stream. The ethanol industry, ammonia, steam methane reforming. There's industrial processes that have very pure CO2. And then short transportation, if we're able to take the CO2 and store it locally there on site, or consume it for EOR where it's permanently stored as well. Those tend to be lower cost than some of the others. But I would say that the range might be for a small project that's relatively simple, in the tens of millions. I would say most of them are in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And there's a great concept that we're espousing, as others are too, to develop hubs, to take areas where perhaps you have emissions, I have emissions, and together we can put those together, capture and share the transportation and storage to reduce the cost overall. But I think one of the things that sometimes why CCUS might not be in the eyes of the average person is because certain things like electrical power are very much in our faces day to day. But people don't think about how much steel they consume. At OGCI, we're working in all these industrial spaces. We're working in steel, cement, and those other industries as well too. And people don't think about how much cement we consume as individuals, and steel and the others. And because of that, we're still going to need CCUS for a long time.
Okay, thank you. Gabrielle, go ahead.
This is just something to build on what all three have said, but particularly what Nigel and Mark were saying. And that's just thinking about the role that CCUS should play. One of the biggest messages that we got in our work talking to people about CCUS who were outside the industry was, show us how it fits in a net zero strategy. Show us how it's a part of an overall climate plan. And I think that one of the things that's been working very heavily against CCS in lots of people's minds is CCS versus this, or this versus that. And I really think that's one of the most damaging mindsets. I call it exclusivism. It's my solution, not yours. It all has to be electricity. It all has to be CCS. And that's why I'd say, Mark, I love particularly what you said about it's the SPE members that are going to be able to do this. And so it's the SPE members that I'm speaking now when I say, I don't think it helps to say the biggest thing that we can do right now to help climate is shift from coal to gas. We need an overall plan, and we need to show how everything fits into that. And I think when we do that, we get better investment cases for CCUS, because you can see how it applies to an overall decarbonisation plan. And that's where the industrial emissions really come in. I love these industrial hubs that we're talking about. It shows how everything fits together and how it's really part of a decarbonisation plan and not this versus that. Just one quick comment. The opening question, should we use CCUS to keep oil and gas in play, or should we stop doing oil and gas? And the answer is that a lot of people have got fixed in their heads, CCUS is about keeping oil and gas in play. And it's not. It's about enabling an energy transition. I think that's a transition that I'd really like people to be able to make in their own head.
Actually, and the question was not about keeping the oil and gas, but more like, and I see that in the comments as well, that given that we know that, that consumption will continue for a while, can it play a role? But because there are many angles to that, and indeed, recent drop in consumption has shown that we can actually decrease consumption. But what will happen, when our economies pick up again? Mark, you raise your hand, I saw.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Gabrielle just said. And I want to come back to the issue of CO2 EOR, because I think she's exactly right. I think it has actually worked against the image of industry, at least in North America, to have focused on EOR. Not that there's anything wrong with EOR, but 90 projects around the world are using CO2 for EOR. They produce about 500,000 barrels a day of oil with EOR. Well, that's 1/10 of what's being produced from unconventional oil and gas reservoirs in the United States alone. So it's not all that much oil, and it is seen by the public, rightly or wrongly, it is seen as a tactic to perpetuate the use of oil and gas. So I'm not against CO2 EOR. It's good to store carbon in the subsurface. But I, as chair of the CCUS Technical Committee for SPE, I've tried to put the focus on storage, because I don't think we've paid enough attention to that, and storage in depleted oil and gas reservoirs, and storage in saline aquifers that are part of, you know, depleted oil and gas reservoirs. In other words, in an oil field, you have oil producing horizons, but you have saline aquifers as well. These are areas which public acceptance, especially when they're offshore, will be a lot easier to achieve. You have infrastructure, you have knowledge of the subsurface. And that's really critical, because you're talking about injecting massive amounts of fluid in a short period of time. To give just one more number, to give a sense of urgency about scale, I said where we had to be, you know, a volume equivalent to the total global oil system 20 years from now. Where are we today? We're at about 1% of that level. And so what we're really talking about is taking the couple dozen CCS projects around the world, a couple dozen are you know, in consideration, but we're really actually talking about increasing what's currently going on by 100-fold. And that is not going to be easy. And that's why we should all have a sense of urgency if CCS is going to be part of this portfolio of solutions. And it has to be considered as such. I think we all agree about that.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So talking about storage, Mark, with your expertise and getting a bit technical here for, I think, those in the audience that would like to know a bit more about that. When you're talking about the scale and the experience with CO2, EOR, so what would make the reservoir suitable for supercritical CO2?
Well, depleted oil and gas reservoirs have the advantage of two advantages. If the oil reservoir is sort of a contained reservoir, so that the pressure went down, the pressure depleted as the oil and gas were produced, then you have the ability to put volume in and raise the fluid back up to something approaching the initial pressure. If it's a reservoir that was sort of aquifer supported, in other words, the pressure was supported by water below the level at which the oil and gas had accumulated, if you inject in the right way, you can maintain the pressure. So pressure is critical. You know, we can do a model, we inject a certain amount of CO2, we see the plume of CO2 as it goes out. Where does it go? Well, I would argue that's important, of course, but it's not nearly as important as where the pressure goes. And when you're injecting into a pore space in the subsurface that is already full of you know, saline you know, water, the pressure is going to go up. So pressure control is a really critical issue. Earthquakes have been a bit of an issue. I've worked on that a lot. The key there is we always think about a top seal for CO2 repositories. We also need a bottom seal. We need to make sure the pressure doesn't get transmitted down into the crystalline basement rocks where earthquakes might occur. These criteria are important, but they're really relatively straightforward, and they can be done as part of site characterization. The only other thing I want to say is we kind of know the geologic attributes, what they should be for an ideal site. And when we consider a depleted oil and gas reservoir, we should remember that we have decades of knowledge that were obtained by the industry as exploration, as development, as production occurred. When we talk about a saline aquifer, it might be ideal, but we start with a zero knowledge base. We have nobody has drilled wells into it. Nobody has measured any of the key properties of that reservoir. So the real challenge with saline aquifers is the fact that we don't have the pre-existing geologic knowledge. We kind of know what the attributes are. And so to me, it's only in part a geologic argument, but if my bumper sticker or elevator speech of what makes a good site is offshore, that's because of the social license to operate, single regulatory authority. It's a depleted oil and gas reservoir because we already know a lot about it. Now, you're not home free at that point. The infrastructure is not everything you need. You still have a lot of work to do. But that's a starting point, which a lot of these other choices, which are all viable from a geologic point of view, but they will take so long to prove up and so long to license and regulate and gain public approval that it may be not something that happens on the time scale or volumetric scale that we really need. So that's my short pitch, and I'm sticking to it.
Yeah. So that's a great bridge, actually, from the needed underground characteristics to what is needed above ground. There's a question about that as well. So what is the greatest barrier to underground storage? Nigel, can I ask you to come on that? What is needed above ground to arrange the subsurface storage?
Yeah, good question. So of course, rules and regulations, I think, around secure geological storage really is what's needed above ground in order to do it effectively and securely. We've got a couple of international standards, one from ISO, the International Standards Organization, number 27914, that covers all aspects of the CCUS supply chain. And with pleasure, and Mark was fundamental in getting this done, was one from the SPE. So we now have the Storage Resource Management System, which covers the development of geological CO2 storage resources and reserves in a framework like PRMS that everybody will likely be familiar with. That basically the technique and framework we use for oil and gas reservoir resource and reserves evaluation. So from a business perspective and above ground viewpoint, these provide clarity, of course, certainty, and reduce risks that would therefore be suitable for wide-scale commercial deployment of CCUS. It protects, of course, the companies that are involved as well by having those clearly adopted and in place. We also have various national and subnational regulations, including here in the United States, the US Federal Class 6 for the well design. That's an underground injection control regulation. 45Q, which is a tax credit, which of course has got some clarity around defining what secure geological storage is and how to actually achieve that. And also the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency's greenhouse gas reporting program, in order to verify actually how much CO2 is injected and ultimately stored. And also US states, from California, where Mark sits, the low carbon fuel standard and its CCS protocol. And of course, it's not just a US thing. There's similar directives, the EU CCS directive, of course, a lot of regulation over in Australia as well. So all of these national and subnational regulations do exist around the world. The primary objective of those is really to protect human health and the environment. The development of those goes back at least 2 decades. I remember where I first started 15 years ago working on CCS, heavily involved in some of those efforts in the EU and here in the US. And of course, what we were looking at was adaptation of existing regulations to get demonstration projects up and running, and then build on that knowledge with performance-based reassessment of the risks later on. So specifically for secure geological storage underpins the role of CCUS as a climate change mitigation technology. It's critical that the performance and permanence of CCUS in preventing and removing CO2 from the atmosphere is credibly delivered, along with ensuring that it does not harm any other resources that could endanger human health or, of course, property.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So a lot of developments around the world. Mark Coalmer, can I ask you to elaborate a bit on the resource catalog that OGCI just launched, and what role it can play in shedding light on the storage capacity that is available, and how it can help investors?
Yeah, you bet. That is a new resource that we have just released, and it's intended, just as you stated there, it's intended to be an investor level confidence and an independent assessment of all the geologic storage assessments that are done around the world. And we've just started it now. We have 13 countries in there so far. We're also leveraging the document that Nigel referenced, the storage RMS that SPE put together as the methodology behind it. And I encourage everybody to go out to our website, take a look at it. You can see it. You can submit your data to add to the database. You can provide comments for it as well. But our goal is to have that cover the entire globe and to make it available for investors to take a look at when they're looking at CCUS projects. And it's really important as we look at these projects, within climate investments, we realize that we need new technologies to bring costs down. And we also need to do actual projects now. And in order to get those projects done, it's going to require investors and investors' money. And there are viable projects today. We are investing in viable projects today. And getting that data out there in people's hands will enable them to do the type of assessments that they need to do to go ahead and make those investments.
Yeah. Okay. I say, oh, yeah, Gabrielle, go ahead.
Just a very quick comment about storage. I'm way out of my depth and also delighted to hear what you're telling me about this, and because it's certainly outside my expertise in spite of my background in chemistry. But I just wanted to make a comment about what we heard when we were speaking to, we've spoken now to more than 220 people as part of this, all of them high-level decision makers as part of our work. And I found something very interesting about storage that just might be useful for this audience to hear, which was it's almost 100%, every single person we spoke to in the industry in some form said, we understand how to do storage. It's that we need to do more research. We need to understand more, as Mark was saying, but broadly speaking, it's not a problem. And almost everybody on the outside has some kind of worry about storage. And some of them are very unsophisticated, like, oh, is that like nuclear waste? And some of them are really much more sophisticated, like, how does it work in a saline aquifer? Or if you're putting CO2 where methane used to be, those two gases have different chemistry. And so I do think that there's an information gap, a conversation gap. And I really don't want to say an education or information. It's not about informing or educating. It's more like having a better conversation. And I spoke to one very brilliant engineer who said, we have a lot of information about this. We studied it a lot, a great academic I met in Australia. And I said, where is it all? And he said, it's in the academic literature. I know that lots of oil and gas companies have this research sort of in their annals, but I don't think it's getting out there into the public with trusted messengers who can really convey what we know and what we don't know and actually have a grown-up conversation about it. So I just throw that in case somebody knows what to do about that.
Would anybody like to comment on that?
I'd like to add a little bit of flavor to that. As we go and we talk about that trust and that confidence, one of the things that we're really keen to do is we want to build upon what others have done to create supportive policy, to advance the science and all the things that are necessary to bring this forward. But we want to act now, and we are acting now. We're investing now. And so, for example, our Wabash Valley project in Indiana, we needed supportive policy. But when we come with a project in hand, I and others spent 6 or 7 hours with a bipartisan group of lawmakers discussing and getting that understanding into their hands so that they could make viable decisions. And they made a good decision, and it supported the project, and the project moved forward. And that moves the policy forward. So we need to work policy, kind of agnostically off to the side. But there's nothing like actually having a project that's viable to bring those things forward.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to go to a question from Maggie Hanna that we received. So to get started with CCUS projects, and see, the question is, where do we start? Industrial clusters, CH4 feedstock, different options to get started. There are already various CCUS projects around the world, some already happening, some on the drawing table. What are your views when you see this question?
I guess I'll start too. Well, go ahead, Nigel.
Nigel?
Yeah, so I would say it depends, just the fact that you're looking to your local situation, whether that indeed is the sources of CO2, fundamentally where they are, how they're composed. Getting back to what Mark said earlier on, of course, high purity CO2 sources is, of course, an early low-hanging fruit area to look at. And then where the storage resources or other forms of utilization, can exist, and those markets, really just look at the basic picture of what the emissions look like today, how they will evolve in time, where your options are for use and storage, and then build indeed a roadmap that really identifies where the easy options are to do, the ones that are not complex, low risk, lowest cost, of course, and then build up through really from that to of course reach scale.
Yeah, I can add to that. Is really that my first reaction to that question is, well, we started 2 or 3 decades ago, so we've already started. And I think the question is, as Nigel addressed, is really getting the traction to go there. And we really need to go where the lowest hanging fruit is, and we are. So, we've invested in climate investments in 4 different CCUS projects so far. You can go to the GCCSI website and find a catalog of the CCUS projects that are happening today. And frankly, we're excited about the opportunities because they're more and more of them are becoming increasingly viable.
Mark Zoback, yeah, I saw you had a question, but just a very quick follow-up question to Nigel. You were talking about a roadmap, and I know that you just mentioned the word roadmap, and it made me think of the roadmap that you have been working on for the National Petroleum Study on CCUS. Could you just, it's a very extensive work, and I know you've been presenting on this a lot, but we cannot do this discussion without you saying something about it. So could you just share the 1 or 2 things that we really need to know about this study?
Oh dear, we definitely risk Nigel going into an hour-long monologue about the NPC study now. So, but I'll try and refrain. That's a hard thing for me to do sometimes. But so I would say 2 or 3 things that people should know about the roadmap is that 1, CCUS creates jobs, it secures existing infrastructure investments, and provides energy security. 2, CCUS indeed. Mark said this, it's volumetrically equivalent to the oil and gas industry today when it's performed at scale. So there's huge opportunities that lie in that for individuals and businesses. In the US, we found that it would require about $680 billion in order to achieve the level of scale that we identified is possible in the United States over the next 20 years. And then thirdly, CCUS holds great potential for innovation and new technology to be transferred into and out of other subsurface development technologies and industries like oil and gas. So the synergies in exploring, developing, operating, processing, transporting, and converting fluids like CO2 or oil and gas are plentiful. People in SPE have all of those skills and experiences and capabilities in order to get behind this and really make this successful.
Okay, thank you. Mark Zoback.
I was going to make a brief comment with respect to how do we get started. I kind of like solving the problem backwards. And what I mean by that is very consistent with OGCI's kind of approach toward developing these hubs. Find the places which have the greatest likelihood of accommodating the storage of large volumes of CO2, and then bring the CO2 to them. Unfortunately, what often happens when we have a source of CO2, we start looking around for a geologic formation that's a suitable storage site. And again, you start with, well, you have no data, you have no buy-in from the public, and you're fighting both the scientific, technical problem, regulatory problem, societal acceptance problem all at once. If you start by focusing on the places that are are most likely to be successful as large-scale repositories, then you really got a leg up on all of these barriers. And then the question is, well, where does the CO2 come from? How do you get it there, and all the rest? Which I think ultimately is the easier part of the problem. So I think I'm sort of a sink-oriented person. If you know where you want to put it, well, if you want to do green, if you want to do blue hydrogen, maybe that's a place you can do blue hydrogen. If you want to do, whatever. But if you solve the geologic part and the permitting part, the societal part first, those are incredible time-consuming barriers. They're not necessarily showstoppers, but they can take you an awful long time to resolve. So when you talk about how do we get started, that's how I think about the problem. From where's a good place to put it, and then build out from there.
Yeah. Gabrielle, very quickly, please, and then we'll go to another question from our audience. Go ahead.
Okay, massive support for what Mark just said about starting with the sinks. I love the Northern Lights project in the North Sea, which is doing exactly that. There's loads of places around Europe that have problems with industrial emissions and don't know what they're going to do. Make a storage site and say you can bring it here, and then they'll come. And I think the same for the Porthos experiment as well in Europe. My answer to where we should start, I'm actually going to disagree slightly now with the other Mark, which is I understand about low-hanging fruit, and there's nothing like showing people this thing really happening. And we have been told, show us it working on the ground. But I'd also say that right now, if we'd started a few decades ago in anger, we could be saying low-hanging fruit. But right now, we need everywhere. So we need demonstrations that it can work with industrial emissions. We need places where there's good storage. We need places where it's saline aquifer. We need places where there's different kinds of onshore, offshore, really to demonstrate how this can work in all sorts of different contexts. And we need to be doing them all in parallel and not just going first for the low-hanging fruit and then seeing the rest. We've got to get really serious about this. And I think one quick comment about that's going to be very, very important and perhaps useful for this audience too, is knowledge transfer. We've done some really good projects on CCS already. I say we, I wasn't involved in any of them, but I know that they have happened. Oil and gas companies have done some really good projects on CCUS and know a lot about how to make it happen, how to get local acceptance, how to do the regulation, how to do the subsurface storage, and just have a mechanism whereby that knowledge really doesn't have to keep getting reinvented. I think is going to be a very, very important part of this story.
Yeah, absolutely. And that there was actually one question about that from the audience on the role that SPE intends to play in that in education. And this was the question was actually directed specifically at educating lawmakers. And I think that under the Gaia umbrella, a number of sessions will take place about CCUS, where the goal is indeed to share that knowledge as widely as possible, and not only among.
Can I just say? Really, really important. I said share, I didn't say educate. I think it's really important to get out of the mindset of those idiots, they don't understand and we're going to teach them. It's actually about having conversations and sharing and listening as much as telling. And really, it's much more effective.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a good nuance in the wording of that, and important to remember. Let's see. I'm conscious of time. There is one question from the chat that I really wanted to raise. It's from Sergio Capusto. CCS is a net additional cost of around $100 per ton CO2. Utilization is crucial to making CCS economically viable. Who can I ask to comment on the U in CCUS? Maybe start
there are
with...
a few of us probably as well, but I could start on that just because we've made some investments in that. CO2 can be used for making cement and curing cement as well too, and CI has invested in that, and in as well with Solidia, we've invested in Boston Metals, which is using an innovative process to make a lower emission steel. We've invested in Econic, which is using CO2 to make polyols. And so there's certainly opportunities out there. Unfortunately, CO2 is more of a benign or inert type of molecule, so it's a little bit more challenging than perhaps some of the other chemicals that we use. But there's a lot of creativity out there, and I have a lot of faith that more and more ideas will come out to do more utilization. Of course, the biggest case for utilization, which also includes storage, is CO2 EOR. And I think that's why CCUS has had that kind of label for quite a long time, because it's a revenue source for that. But there are other opportunities out there. We're investing in them, and we see more great things on the horizon for that too. Okay,
thank you. Nigel, I see you raise your hand. Maybe in your comment, can I ask you to dovetail that into your last message, because we're actually in so
yeah, we'll do it. So I'd say, and definitely I will. That's good. So utilization, I think, is an exploding area of innovation and startups right now, and it's great to hear about those investments that OGCI is making. There are so many opportunities around materials, chemicals, fuels, and markets to look at how CO2 could be used as really a backbone to a lot of those products. Beyond, of course, the historical use of CO2 for enhanced oil recovery, and explore whether we can build some of the gap that really sits between CO2 EOR, its value, that it can pay for CO2 conventionally, let's say around $20 a ton, to meet that differential, which where CCUS at scale and cost is at circa $100 a ton. Yes, of course, there's a lot of variation in that as well. Anyway, so dovetailing that into, I think my exiting comments is, it is an exciting area to be involved with, and which SPE members are uniquely positioned to contribute to and give something back to Mother Earth, Gaia. I think we may produce fossil fuels and be involved with that, but with CCUS we can prove to society that this is not with fossilized thinking.
Thank you. That's a great closing statement. Thank you. So yeah, I want to ask all of you the same closing questions. If our audience is going to remember one thing, what should it be? Mark Coalmer, can I ask you to go next, please?
Sure, you bet. I would say, and certainly I agree with Gabrielle's clarification of my earlier statements. We have to do everything in parallel. CCUS is vital. It cannot be done. We cannot achieve our goals without CCUS. So that needs to happen. In order to do it, we've got to progress the most promising projects now. And OGCI and CI are doing that, progressing those things in parallel. In addition to that, we've got to improve the technologies and the policy for future projects. So those things together, in addition to all the renewables and other solutions that are out there, are vital. So it's important that we don't, quote unquote, waste our intellectual power and energy on debating which is better. The economics of the world will help dictate that, but we focus on doing what we can do today. And Climate Investments is doing that. We welcome the collaboration of others. We welcome your project technologies and ideas, because we know we can go much faster and much further together.
Thank you very much, Mark Coalmer. Mark Zoback, what are your final comments, takeaways for the audience?
I think I'd just like to echo what Nigel said. This is a tremendous opportunity for SPE members to be part of the solution and not part of the problem. And as Gabrielle mentioned, the way the oil industry is viewed in the public is not favorable in general, and it's more severe in some parts of the world than the other. But this is a global societal need, and I encourage SPE members to step up and be part of the solution. And not seen as only being part of the problem. I think that's a harsh way of looking at the oil and gas industry, an unfair way of looking at the oil and gas industry, but it is the way many people look at the oil and gas industry. Now is the time to step forward and help solve the problem.
Okay, thank you. Gabrielle.
Okay, I'm going to go. I think the biggest message I want to leave everybody with today, if I can, is try to quit thinking about CCS as a kind of grudging compliance or a way to keep hydrocarbons in play, and really see the opportunities. That's when it gets most exciting. It's not a technology in a box. It's not one technology versus lots of others. It's an enabler of so many things. It's an enabler of hydrogen. It's an enabler of dealing with process emissions. It's an enabler of negative emissions in the future. I think it's going to be one of the most exciting areas to be involved in. And so that's why I'm putting my heart and soul into working on it now. There are many easier ways of making a living, like, I don't know, lion taming or shark wrestling, but getting to scale, I think, is the biggest and most exciting challenge that we have in the energy transition. So for God's sake, go for it.
All right, thank you very much. We have come at the end of this SPELive Gaia talk. It's time for me to close this. Luckily, it's not television that we're being cut off, so I can take 1 minute to close this panel. So we have covered a lot of ground. We talked about drivers mitigating climate change effects, the role of CCUS and the role of our industry, how the two are mutually beneficial. We talked about barriers, and we see a lot of concerns in the comments. We haven't addressed all of them. Concerns over what makes a good storage reservoir, concerns over above ground risk legislation, a level of knowledge, the need for international collaboration. I'm sure that if we had another hour that you would have a couple of solutions for each of those. But the fact is that there is still some way to go. There are roadmaps being developed in several countries. A lot of people, a lot of organizations are working on it, and I think that you made it abundantly clear what potential roles there are out there for people to play, and also what the outlook can be. A couple of words of thanks. The SPE Foundation for enabling this SPELive, the people behind the Gaia initiative and the technical sections for sustainable development and for CCUS. Our panelists, of course, Nigel Jenvey of Gaffney Klein and Associates, Mark Coalmer of OGCI Climate Investments, Mark Zoback of Stanford University and SPE Technical Session, and Gabrielle Walker of Valence Solutions. Thank you very much. I really hope that we can continue this discussion at some point. There have been many great comments in the chat that I'm sure we will all have a look at and maybe be able to revisit. So thank you very much. This is it for today for SPELive. Tomorrow, there is another SPELive session on the industry outlook in the US. And on Thursday, another SPELive with a preview on the upcoming HSE and sustainability virtual conference and virtual exhibition. So thank you very much and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.